And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and I am most appreciative of you joining us for this continuing conversation on the biblical narrative as Holomovement. And what we've brought into the picture as we look at the way we are to understand the story, which is the biblical narrative, is through a cross disciplinary approach. And again, I want to emphasize that the future of unity on our planet will come from the concept of convergence. Convergence means that we are seeing more and more and more that we are not in a universe of separated parts. We are not on a planet of people that are separated parts. Convergence is meaning that we are becoming aware that all things are interconnected. And we certainly see this in science. If you watch any type of scientific documentary, you see immediately, yes, everything in this universe is interconnected and it goes all the way down to the quantum scale and beyond. When we get to people, not so much. We are still trying to deal with unity. So I go back to convergence. The biblical narrative clearly states that the end of the story, the conclusion of the story, is the revelation that God is all in all. That's the conclusion of the story. And that only happens when the last enemy is destroyed. And the last enemy for human beings, with regard to our God relationship, is the enemy of sin and death. And so convergence would mean that God is all in all. Therefore, God is in science, ecology, biology, physics. God is in all aspects of all that came into existence from God as source. That includes, at the end of the story, the human who comes onto the scene. What we have not yet begun to realize is the degree to which we as human beings are interconnected. And one of the biggest partitions, walls, challenges is religion. And specifically, I'm speaking coming from Christianity. And as I've quickly added in every single session, this is not because I have discarded the biblical narrative. I haven't. It is not because I have discarded Christology. I haven't. It's not because I've taken some of the Gospels and said, well, this doesn't belong, because I haven't. Nor have I taken the apostolic writings and said, well, here's pieces of the apostolic writing that don't belong. Why? Because they don't fit my viewpoint. I haven't. Nor have I done the same with John's revelation. Instead, what I've said is, and what I've proposed is, the problem with the biblical narrative is the history of its interpretation. And that interpretation has changed through time over and over and over again, resulting in literally thousands of denominations, which again, when I speak the word denominate, I speak the word separate, and that is not unity. To say what denomination I am is to tell people, here's the way in which I separate myself from all others. And so in this whole picture of science, why am I using science? I'm using science because it is an objective field of proof. Scientists can do experimentation and prove to us these different elements that come together in a unified way. It starts with Sir Isaac Newton and this Newtonian view of science, where Sir Isaac Newton showed the principle of gravity. We know that. We don't argue with that there's gravity. It's proven. If you were a person who disagreed with that and said, well, that's not my opinion is gravity doesn't exist, you probably won't see that person around much longer. So, the point of science is that it is in the objective realm. The problem when you get into theology and the biblical narrative, when you get into all other narratives with regard to some type of God belief, spirituality, etc., is that within theology itself, and I'll just stick to the biblical narrative here, you are in a closed system of argumentation. And so, what has been the result? The result is that people have studied the biblical narrative for 2,000 years, and every single denomination has leadership within that says we can prove by reason that our denomination, our viewpoint, our interpretations are the correct ones. But this hasn't solved anything. Have people finally said, oh, Calvinism is it, Arminianism is it, Catholicism is it, Protestantism is it, being a Jehovah Witness is it. Oh, no, a Mormon, we should be a Mormon. That's it, Mormonism is it. No, we ought to go back with the Amish. Amish are the true Christians. Every single seminary is backed by some type of perspective related to an interpretation of Christology that disagrees with other seminaries, other positions, other theologians. And so all that you end up with today, at the very best, is choose one. Just pick one, or you can join those who like to debate, jump on your keyboard, and start arguing with people on the internet. That's what we're calling the story of the biblical narrative? We're questioning that, and we're saying to those that are in progressive Christianity, especially, that our view based on spiral dynamics is that your next step will be into an integral stage. And that's the stage of convergence, and that's the stage where God becomes all in all. And when that has happened, you will no longer call yourself a Christian. Now, can you see why people don't invite me to speak very often at their conferences, at their events, or why someone would not want me to come into their church to announce to them that we must now move beyond denominations and church and the label Christian? Not a thing that is going to be very well accepted. I know this. I've given my life to these conversations, and I can't tell you why they don't want presence involved in their conversations, except to say that we are a direct threat to their identity. What have they identified with? They have identified with Christology as an institutional, form-based world religion. That's what it is. You certainly can't deny that, right? That's what Christianity is. It's one of many religions. Now, this is why I go to the Holomovement. The Holomovement is not religious. The universe is not religious. The implicate order from which the explicate order emerged, according to science, is not religious. And yet, it's a God story. In the beginning, God. Heavens and earth, creation, sun, moon, and stars, planets, ocean animals, land animals, of the air. That's a God story. That is no less a God story than everything else that follows in the biblical narrative. You cannot say that science is not the study of a God story. It is, just as theology is a study of a God story. Now, the question is, how does all that match up or not match up? Now, if you're watching this because you get our newsletter, You saw in the newsletter, and I'm going to explain this for those of you who are subscribers on YouTube and who watch our videos, but you're not getting our newsletter. Which, by the way, if I may do a commercial, if you go to presence.tv, that's our website. The first thing it's going to ask you is if you want to be on our newsletter email list. So if you just go to presence.tv, you'll get newsletters from me that say, hey, here comes the next episode. Here's what I'm going to talk about. For those that saw that, you know that in the newsletter, I said, we're going to have a theological quiz. Today, we're going to have a theological quiz. So just when you thought that theology could not get any more exciting, by golly, we're going to have a quiz today. Now, here's the good news. You can take it in the privacy of your car, your home, wherever you are listening or watching this, and no one will know how you came out on the quiz. But I'm doing a lot of summary work today, so I thought we would just start with a general quiz. And to that point, I'm going to take off my video. I'm going to go to share screen. I'm going to share a document, and I'm going to start here. And here's the theological quiz. Here's what it's based on. For those of you who grew up or have children or grandchildren that watch Sesame Street, this is not original to me. This theological quiz is taken directly from Sesame Street. Now, here's what I am using that I want to make sure and attribute to them and not take credit for it. Sesame Street, when I used to watch it with the kids, had a thing that where they would show a multiplicity of things to the children, and then they would ask this question: which of these things is not like the others? Which of these things is not like the others? So that's our theological quiz for today. Let's see how you do. I'm going to start with diagram 1, which is the diagram of our universe. For those of you who remember, I have attached a link to, in times past, an article that I wrote with cosmologist Jude Currivan, who has a master's in quantum physics from Oxford and a PhD in anthropology, Dr. Kurt Johnson, who is a well-known and vastly published evolutionary biologist, and Dr. Bob Atkinson, who's a developmental psychologist. And my whole paper was based on the Holomovement in terms of its structure and how it relates to the two orders that were proposed in the last century by Dr. David Bohm, a quantum physicist. And I wrote this paper with them, not because it's a religious paper, it's not. It's just I'm not a scientist, and I didn't want to put this diagram up and talk to you about it from a theological standpoint unless I had people from science who would say, yeah, what Doug is seeing here, the way he used the Venn diagram to show and illustrate through picture the implicate and explicate order and how those are intertwined. They're interrelated. They're not separate from each other. The explicate order is the universe we see that is made up of forms or things. That's the wording of Dr. Bohm, that our universe is made up of forms or things. And it comes from an implicate source that transcends forms or things. Therefore, I put over there in the right-hand circle, formless, because it transcends. That's the source. The source is superior to that which is the subject of the source. And so the implicate order is the basis of every form or thing. When you start studying forms or things, you will then find out that what looks like a rock is actually made up of molecules, is actually made up of atoms, is actually made up of waves. And you're getting into the quantum realm, and you keep going mathematically in derivatives and algebra and all the calculus that's involved, and finally you get down to the quantum pixel and you realize that beyond that is no things or no thingness. What connects that is the Holomovement, and the Holomovement is the undivided flow, says B.J. Hiley, quantum physicist, the undivided flow between implicate and explicate. And that flow is two ways. At first, the Holomovement is the movement or flow in an informing way where you end up with forms. So it's informing. Human consciousness now is moving back toward an understanding of the implicate, and with the advent of human consciousness, the movement is going from the explicate order of forms into an understanding of that which is formless or beyond time and space, beyond all form. And that process of movement from forms into an implicate formless space is called transform or transformation. So the Holomovement flow is a two-way flow of informing and transforming. And there we see the diagram. Two orders. That's the main thing I want to call attention to here. It's made up of two orders. That's diagram one. We're still in the quiz. Let's go to diagram two. Diagram two is our proposal for an integral theology that we have been saying in a lot of different ways for years and years. And that is, the biblical narrative is a story of two orders. And the two orders are really explained as two ages, this age and the age to come, or this world and the world to come, or the Jerusalem that now is in the explicate world, a Jerusalem defined by geography, a form, an external form, and a Jerusalem which is known as and called the New Jerusalem, which is not confined to geography, and it transcends geography, it transcends time, it transcends gender, ethnicity, race, class, on and on we go. That's New Jerusalem. That's the second order. And what we did was we went to Galatians 4, right, where Paul's cosmology is predicated on this very diagram that Paul sees that there has been, up to that time in history, an understanding of God identity that's based on different types of forms, temples and priesthoods and animal sacrifices. And that thinking, that paradigm was made subject purely to law. That's the only way they understood their God identity, was through law, because that was the first step in the process. And that meant that everyone's God identity was determined to be either obedient or disobedient. And there would be consequences if you were in the disobedient box. And so Christology, we're saying, is the movement from a transform movement from that explicate order of forms into this implicate order of formlessness. But that there's two orders, and that's because there's two mountains, Sinai and Zion. There's two covenants, the first and second covenant, which we'll talk about this in a bit, and the two Jerusalems and so forth. So this is the second one. And do you see how this is a mirror image of our universe? And why I'm saying that the Holomovement is to the cosmology of our universe what Christology is to the cosmology of the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative cosmology is the mirror image of the cosmology of our universe, because they are both God's stories And if they are both God's stories, we should fully expect that those stories align themselves, converge, integrate, unify. And that's what we're saying. So that's picture number 2. We go back. Here's your final test question. Here's number 1. Here's integral theology. Now we're going to look at number 3, and that's current theology. Here's current theology. In current theology, you have the biblical narrative telling the story of what we all know worldwide as the Abrahamic religions. And those Abrahamic religions are Judaism and all that belongs to that form, Christianity and all that belongs to that form, and Islam and all that belongs to that form. So here is your test question. Which of these ones is not like the other? Here's your final look. Here's the universe. Here's an integral approach to theology. Here's the current state of theology. So, for those of you that are struggling with this, maybe you're Christian, the answer is number 3. Current theology is the problem. It's the theology that's taught in seminaries. It's given to pastors. Pastors turn around and give it to congregations, and all of it according to the appropriate denomination to which the seminary and the pastor belong. And then we podcast about it, and we write books about it, and we make sure that everyone knows that whatever you do, just make sure that you still identify as a Christian. You can see that in this third chart, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are their own circles. There is no Venn here. The cross, in fact, is a hard line point of differentiation between Judaism and Christianity. Islam, for example, traces their genealogy back to Ishmael. In the story of Isaac and Ishmael, in the biblical narrative, the story is told that it is Isaac who receives the inheritance under the laws of inheritance as they stood at that time, and that Ishmael did not receive the inheritance because he was a child of the handmaiden, Hagar. Now, a number of things here. First of all, with current theology, Abraham had 2 sons, says Paul, not 3. Again, which one has 3 and which one has 2? For those of you listening, I'm showing the diagrams again. The universe has 2, explicate and implicate. Integral approach to theology is proposing 2 orders, explicate and implicate. Current theology says, well, there's 3. And the whole point of this consciousness that comes from this implicate order that existed before the universe, from which the universe emerged, this amazing super consciousness, was a consciousness whose thoughts were, wouldn't it be wonderful to use this man Abraham to create 3 world religions? Wow, what a vision. You can tell I'm being sarcastic. Yes, I am. Because these 3 forms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have had through history and continue to have in different parts of the world a history of hostility. Now, let's look at what Paul says when he talks about Ishmael and Isaac. He says they represent 2 orders. But the whole point of the God story, says Paul, is that the wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile is taken down via the Christological work of God. The wall of hostility. That's a wall that's still up today because of current theology. The best you can do is go to an interfaith meeting. And here's the thing about an interfaith meeting: when you go to an interfaith meeting, you cannot say anything critical about the rabbi, the Islamic teacher, or the Christian priest, pastor, etc. You best you can do there is say we should respect each other. We should coexist. And the question we're asking is coexisting the height of our planetary evolution? Is that truly unity? And we're saying it never has been, and it certainly isn't now, even to the degree if I just isolate over there to Christianity, that one form, and I go inside that form, it's made up of thousands of denominated forms. That's what happens when you're in the realm of form, because form is boundary driven, and each form will have boundaries that give meaning to what is within, meaning there'll be some type of dogma, doctrine, creed that's necessary to define what makes a Christian versus what makes a member of Judaism or Islam. Christology was never meant to be a religion. It was a first century only transformative movement of the ages. And that is where the problem has come in. So let's think about these two orders and my integral approach that also involves first, second, and third person. I brought this up before. My diagram on integral theology takes first, second, and third person into account to tell an integrated and complete story. Why am I saying that? First, second, and third person appears in the language of every culture, every tribe, every nation that exists on this planet today in all languages. As Ken Wilber says, there must be something to it. Now, what does first, second, and third person have to do with the Bible? It's like saying, what's science have to do with the Bible? Well, let's go to Christology. Christology is founded upon Jesus, the individual Jesus. He is the firstborn one. He is first person transformation. That first person transformation was symbolized by the cross and resurrection event of the individual Jesus of Nazareth. Why does the Bible tell the story that Jesus was put to death in his biological form and that he was also raised from the grave in that same form? Although it took on a different nature, as we know in the Gospels. But why? And it is because we would never have known what Christ was modeling if it was not for an outward sign. And the outward sign of transformation was the sign that came through the symbol of the literal physical body of Christ, which was a symbol of a greater spiritual transformation. So the spiritual transformation is witnessed to by the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Some progressive Christians say that they don't actually believe Jesus was raised from the dead in terms of his body coming out of the tomb. To which I say, well, rather than arguing about that, what is the meaning of the story when you're talking about resurrection? And I'm talking about resurrection. What's the meaning of the story? You see, when you get into this, you're moving beyond those old dogmatic arguments and you're allowing people to have beliefs and faith of their own, because the real question is, what is the meaning? To what was that pointing? Well, let's go first of all beyond Christology as first person, because it's also second person. Second person is the collective. Second person is the collective, and the collective died with Christ. But they didn't do it because they all went out and got crucified on a cross. In second person, the witnessing of it came from the outward sign of baptism and Eucharist. For baptism, Paul telling them, teaching them that water baptism was a symbol that they had died with Christ. So, no, they weren't crucified on a cross. The collective had an outward symbol of baptism that they had died with Christ. What did the second person Christological body model? What were they dying to? They were dying to the explicate order that was under a covenant, or we might say, which was under a paradigm of consciousness with regard to God identity. They were dying to attachment to temples and priesthoods and animal sacrifices and circumcision and other things that had nothing to do with the inward spirit or the kingdom within or the dwelling of God in the heart. And so, through the symbol of baptism, they died to that with Christ. And then, as a show that they were living out that death, just as Jesus was in the tomb 3 days living out that death, enduring that death, they took the Eucharist. And Paul clearly taught that as often as you do this, you are showing, modeling the death of Christ until he comes. And that coming, or parousia, was the sign that that explicate order had come to an end, and that happened about 40 years after the cross. That's what they were living out in second person. And that event was tied to when the temple itself went down. I'm going to talk about temple in very great detail in one of my upcoming video casts. But here's the points I'm making just for our summary session for today. That is that Christology is a modeling, an outward modeling of first and second person transformation. And the collective is problematic when it got extended through history as a new religion, and therefore you have the church. Not really something that exists. You have thousands of iterations of people saying on the sign out in front of a building, this is X church, this church, that church. But that is not what we're proposing is the role and function of Christology. It was a first century only transformative movement whereby the changing of the ages was taking place. And when we talk about the change of the ages or the change of worlds or the coming of a new heaven and earth or the coming of a new Jerusalem, we are now talking about the it space of third person. Cosmology is a third person result. How would we have ever known that the paradigm called First Covenant was moving into the paradigm we know as Second Covenant, both of which have their own ways of describing God identity. The first by keeping laws, regulations, and conditions under what required law, and the second under grace, whereby human doing is not the source of identity, but God and God alone is the source of identity, and therefore all human beings become included under this implicate order that moves us beyond doing requirements and conditions. We move from doing to being. How could anyone have known that these things were happening unless we had a symbol like temple, priesthood, and things that went away in that century, and which explain why in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus teaches extensively on the coming of the end, and that it is related directly to the coming destruction of that temple. And let me add quickly here, not because God was excluding Israel in any way, shape, or form. In fact, Paul explains to the Gentiles that first and foremost, Israel is the root of this whole story, that she herself is being delivered from bondage to a building and to these other forms, that Israel herself is included in this work of salvation, which is meaning deliverance from bondage. That's salvation, deliverance from bondage, bondage to doing, bondage to doing. So Israel was delivered, but not only Israel, then the whole world, because these two orders indicate that there was a movement in the first century from ethnocentric to world centric. And this is why you had to have a first person Christ and you had to have a second person body to model during this 40-year period, to model the changing of the ages. Without that modeling, we would have had no way of really knowing or understanding the role and function of Christ as priest, the role and function of Christ as king, and that the explicate order and its paradigm called First Covenant was passing away. It had last days, it was subject to time, and it had an end. And at the same time, there was a birthing, both on an individual basis, Christ firstborn, on a second person basis, firstborn ones of those who were body, and then the third person cosmological birth of the creation that was groaning because it was birthing on a cosmological third person basis the entire creation into an identity of child of God, not child of Christ, child of God. Child parent is regarding source of identity. The parent is the source of the identity, and that is God, as clearly taught by Paul. And that is a mirror image of our universe where the implicate order is the source from which our explicate order of this universe emerged. So we can see how first, second, and third person completely integrate to make this happen, if you will. So that's where I'm going to end it for today. I wanted to do a summary. I wanted to keep going back over these things because right now, this whole Christian world has had 2,000 years of programming. And the 2,000 years of programming have led people to a point where they cannot even imagine anything other than being called Christian. And yet we see that that very language is full of separation and division. And that we remember separation is the definition of death in the story. And so we're going to keep proposing this, even though it's being resisted. And for those of you in presence, I would just say be patient. This is the year 2024. Anytime new paradigms and major shifts, and by the way, this is as big as it gets, right? A shift from Christian to post Christian, trans religious, whatever we want to use to try to describe that, into a universal human identity where we keep the narrative, which I do. I study it constantly. I keep Christology, but I know that I am no different than any other person on this planet. I am a child of that which the biblical narrative calls God, just like everyone else on this planet. I have some level of consciousness regarding that, and so do they. But that doesn't change the fact that they are a child of God. And because the nature of God is a nature that first reconciles and a nature that restores, tells me that whatever is going on with all other people on the planet is God's business, not mine. Don't look to me to write a rule book or be your judge. But I take great encouragement in that because I'm in the same boat as all other human beings. So, yes, I disagree with progressive Christians, and I wonder why they have yet to want to enter into a discussion about these things. But that's again just where we are in history, and resistance is always the first reaction when someone comes along with a new and most radical paradigm. I get that. I've always gotten that. But you know what? I'm totally at peace with where things are today, totally at peace with where all of us are in our communication as followers of this new paradigm, if you will. I love being a part of the evolutionary leaders movement because it is there that I can have this discussion. The evolutionary leaders have warmly embraced me. They have encouraged me. They've published some things that I'm writing. I'm on different panels with them. They love this approach because what I'm saying is that we're all the same. And I am trying to show that the biblical narrative is not what so many of them think, which is it's a religious book that they don't want any part of, and it's made up of fundamentalist thinkers that they don't want to even go around because of their attitudes. And so I see that this is important to the future of the biblical narrative, and I'll keep doing it as long as I'm blessed with the good health to do it. So that's the end of it for today. We're going to stop here. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.